So you're asking me about insurgent planning and in what way am I an insurgent planner?
Yes.
Yes, so I would say as an insurgent planner, one would try to see planning through the eyes of not just end users, which would be individuals, but collectives, so what we tend to call communities, how people collectively are affected by our planning, and by looking at planning from that side, to then critique planning, not only critique planning, but do something about it. So as an insurgent planner, I think what I have had the opportunity to do is work with community organizations, community-based organizations, representatives of communities, and understanding how they are affected by planning, and then trying to, in some way or another, become involved. And it has involved, for instance, in the Slovo Park community, an informal settlement, that is, of getting City of Johannesburg, for instance, to shelve a formal plan that Urban Dynamics, a planning firm, had come up with and had actually already taken through the approval processes. That was quite a, I think, an insurgent kind of planning intervention from, it was myself and Neil Klug in the school, together with a group of human rights, sort of a human rights organization, SERI, that had been accompanying this community for a while, but in the task team meetings, we were able to critique this plan to the point that we finally convinced the city to shelve the plan because its implications for the community would have been detrimental. They would all have had their shacks and houses demolished, and they would have had to move somewhere else, and only some of them could have moved back to a layout plan that was actually not very beneficial for them. But that's not a comfortable thing to do. It takes a lot of courage. One kind of questions whether one is actually even allowed to do that as a planner. Are you allowed to critique your colleagues' work in that way and actually get their work shelved? They still got paid for their work, but so we went through, there's certain dilemmas, but ethically, if that is your ethical framework, I think we're required to do that. We are required to critique and take action. Yes, and I think as an insurgent planner, I also occasionally submit commentary on proposed legislation, did an extensive commentary on the land use scheme, the new City of Joburg land use scheme, which in my view was not SPLUMA compliant, because it leaves out informal settlements, doesn't mention informal settlements at all, whereas SPLUMA actually says all land use management schemes have to incorporate innovative ways to make sure that informal settlements are gradually integrated into the urban fabric. And to my horror, although I had submitted this formally through the formal channels, no changes were made, and the approved land use scheme is still the same. So now, as an insurgent planner, I still have to do something about that. I will have to contact the city and make probably a big issue of it. I'm thinking of writing an opinion piece maybe in the paper to expose the issue and to raise more awareness, because as an individual, you don't achieve much. As an insurgent planner, we were able to do this work around Slovo Park's plan because we were involved in a process, and we were actively part of a process. There was a collective, the community agreed with us, the human rights lawyers agreed with us, and that backing helped. As a lone voice, you don't get very far. So insurgent planners tend also to work with social movements, to work collectively, to work collaboratively. And I think another example is a few of us in the school are involved in debates around urban land reform. And what we've tried to do is, wherever possible, insert our ideas into the formal channels. So there was a high-level presidential panel on land reform, and luckily one of us was invited, and we brought the others in and kind of submitted a collective submission on that. And now, because we've done that, we also asked to be on other panels and so on. And we're also going to have a discussion here, by the way, on the 23rd of October in A1 at lunchtime about urban land reform. So that's another example. Okay. So your second question was about the community. How can professional planners, I think you were saying include communities in insurgent planning, was it that?
Is that the second question?
Yes.
I think I was trying to understand whether I might have misunderstood what my reading was telling me, but I was trying to understand whether planning professionals, like professional planners,
Yes.
are required to
Be insurgent.
practice insurgent planning.
Okay.
Or is it, do you require a member of a community, or not too sure?
Right. So I think the last we want is that insurgent planning becomes a tick box. Because yes, planners are required to do community participation. And as we know, it often just, as in the case of Slovo Park, meant that Urban Dynamics had a mass meeting in Slovo Park where they passed this one plan by everybody. Do you want housing or not? This is the plan, yes or no. People of course said yes because they do want housing, but they didn't understand the plan at all. There was no alternative plan. There was no reasoning as to why this, oh, you've got dolomite, that's why this is. We are professionals. When we plan, we make sure this is a good community for you. There you are, here's your plan, do you want it or not? People said yes, and in the next task meeting, and they're all following task meetings, they kept saying, well, the community approved this, we did participation, the community is happy with this plan, so that box is ticked, and now it goes to the next approval, which is in the city, and from there it goes there, and then the plan is approved. And people in the community didn't understand that plan, didn't understand the implications that their houses, a lot of them had built-in brick, their houses would be demolished, they would not get compensated. They would have to move out of that settlement into a transit camp somewhere, very uncertain whether ever they would get back, who would get a house. Many of them don't qualify for a subsidy, they would not get their place back in that community, in that area. The last thing you want to go around saying is that all planners should be insurgent, and you have to do it because that means that's the way they will be doing it. They will not sort of, it will just reduce the wood. So I think insurgent planning, by definition, is alternative planning. You can only have something alternative if there's a mainstream and there's an alternative. What we, of course, try and do in the school is make sure that all students that come through the school have an ethic of insurgency and that they would want to question mainstream planning. And in their practice, whether they're a government official or whether they're a consultant, to find ways of ensuring. So if I were the consultant appointed for that Slovo Park doing the work that Urban Dynamics had done, there's nothing that it would have stopped me as a planning professional to do this in a participatory way with the community, to run workshops with them, to make sure that in my budget that I submitted in the first place, I included time to do all of that, and not just tick the box. So I think that's very important that more and more planners kind of believe that that's the way to do it, and start doing it that way, but not because it sort of has to be done, but because they really feel it's what they want to do, ethically inclined to do. Just an example of a government official at City of Joburg who's insurgently within the housing department. He's not a planner as such, but I think it would be very similar to a planner doing this, is trying to get the department in itself to work in a more participatory way, in a way that allows informal settlements not to be disrupted, and reading the policy in that way, but facing a whole lot of blockages. All the other officials are seeing it the other way and don't want to be involved in communities and whatever, and there's one person who's trying to turn this around from inside, and I think that's a very, very important insurgent role that someone's playing inside a government department. So there's no thing like saying, if you're an official, you can't be an insurgent planner. If you're official, you're bad. If you're community-based, you're good. No, and a lot of people do very bad stuff down in the community level. You can be very patronizing. You can be very, not really truly insurgent. Or you can link up with the wrong people in the community. It's all these things are very. You need a lot of, what I want to say, you need a lot of careful reading of the situation to do this insurgent work properly. You have to be careful in terms of who you work with at a local level, always aware of the politics that go on in communities and so on. So it's not a simple, easy thing, and that's why our planning degree also includes courses on the politics of governance and so on, on community participation. It's complex stuff. It's not just something you just go in and do. Yes, and then you had another question, and this had to do with the invented and invited space and how communities do insurgent planning from below across these spaces. And again, the Slovo Park is a nice example because they did a lot of protesting initially, and then the elders in their community were saying to them, guys, you're not achieving much doing this, you're inconveniencing the wrong people. The government officials are not inconvenienced by the fact that you're closing the highway down there. And so they started reflecting on their own approaches. And they've insisted on the statutory invited spaces to be opened up properly for them. And so the task team that was set up, that is supposed to meet monthly and has for a while met monthly, is actually a statutory an invited space. But if it hadn't been for the insurgency of this community, that space would have just again been treated as a tick box. So there was that community went through the court even to ensure that the statutory process was done properly. And I think there's a very, very useful lesson from that for communities, especially when these invented spaces, protest after protest, are not actually achieving much, are leading to more and more infrastructure being damaged, schools burned down. It always also attracts the wrong people to these protests sometimes. Angry people with rightly angry but doing the wrong things, hard to. So once that Slovo Park community decided to go through the courts in order to unlock the invited spaces properly, the statutory requirements of the state to make sure that that is done properly. And that in this case was to make sure that an in-situ upgrading process, the upgrading of informal settlements program, was properly implemented. And that involves a lot of participation, so that the task team was necessary, and the task team includes the community, the community's representatives. And again, that was contested. Other groups came and said, but we the representatives. And the city then had to have a community mass meeting in which they then endorsed the SPCDF. But then through the back door, somehow this alternative group kept coming back into the meetings, and we assume corruptly so, in the interest of some officials maybe, or the councillor, we don't know, perhaps again pushing for a particular agenda that would kind of mean a particular contractor ultimately would get to do the job, but then would be kicked back. We don't know, but it was a very difficult to read kind of context that even played itself out in the invited space. And so this insurgency is something that's, we had to be there all the time reading these politics and trying to counter some of them, saying the right things at the right time, supporting or undermining where necessary. So it's a long-term commitment. We've been in this process since April 2016 that the judgment was passed, and this task team is still sort of slowly progressing, and we don't know for how long, so we have to remain committed. Which also means that, of course, is always difficult if you're a planning professional, you've been commissioned to do X, Y, Z in a time frame. But we actually are convinced that if Urban Dynamics had known what they should have done from the beginning and done this properly, we wouldn't be sitting here in 2019. That process would have run smoothly with all the correct invited spaces properly. So I just want to say that, yes, communities have to sometimes push for those invited spaces to be properly opened up, and at times they have to use the invited spaces. It was just an interesting example of how that worked in Slovo Park. Good.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
That was helpful.
Hope you learned something.
Yes.